Right now, somewhere, a baby is crying in a crib. A parent is standing outside the door. Every instinct says go in. Every parenting book from the last 20 years says something different. Wait. Let them settle. Don't create a habit you can't break. But the real answer is far stranger than anything in those books. In the 1960s, a psychologist did something that sounds almost cruel by today's standards. She put babies in a room with their mothers. Then she had the mothers walk out. She watched what happened next. Her name was Mary Ainsworth, and she wasn't trying to be cruel. She was trying to answer a question that had haunted child psychology for decades. What actually happens inside a baby's mind when it's left alone? Before Ainsworth, the leading theory was simple, almost mechanical. Babies cried because they wanted something. Food, warmth, comfort. Give them what they want, the thinking went, and the crying stops. Don't give it to them too often, or you'll spoil them. This was the dominant advice handed to parents for half a century. Then a researcher named Harry Harlow ran an experiment that broke that theory completely. Harlow worked with infant rhesus monkeys. He took them from their mothers and gave them two artificial substitutes. One was made of bare wire, but it dispensed milk. The other was covered in soft cloth, but it gave nothing. No food, no water. If the old theory was right, the babies should have ignored the cloth mother. It offered nothing they needed to survive. They didn't ignore it. They clung to it for hours. They only left to feed at the wire mother and then rushed straight back to the soft one. When researchers introduced something frightening into the cage, the baby monkeys didn't run toward the food source. They ran toward the comfort. Something in them needed contact more than it needed calories. This was the first real crack in the old theory. Comfort wasn't a side effect of survival. For these infants, comfort was a survival need in its own right. Ainsworth took this idea and asked a harder question. If comfort is a need, then what happens when a baby doesn't get it consistently? Does the need go away, or does it just go quiet? She designed something called the strange situation. A baby and a parent enter an unfamiliar room full of toys. A stranger comes in. The parent leaves. The baby is alone with the stranger for a few minutes. Then the parent returns. Researchers weren't watching what happened when the parent left. They were watching what happened when the parent came back. Most babies did what you'd expect. They cried when the parent left. They reached for them, climbed onto them, sought comfort the moment they returned. Ainsworth called this secure attachment. It was the most common pattern, and it looked exactly like what most people imagine a healthy bond looks like. But not every baby reacted this way. Some babies cried hard when left alone, but when the parent came back, they couldn't be soothed. They reached out and pushed away at the same time. Angry, clingy, inconsolable. Ainsworth called this anxious attachment. And then there was a third group, a group that unsettled the researchers the most. These babies didn't cry when the parent left. They didn't run to them when the parent came back. They barely reacted at all. On the surface, they looked calm. Independent, even. Some early observers might have called them easy babies, low maintenance. But Ainsworth's team measured something the eye couldn't see. They tracked heart rate and stress hormone levels in these calm infants. Their bodies were in full alarm. Heart rate spiked, cortisol surged. Every physiological signal said the same thing the crying babies' bodies were saying: distress, threat, abandonment. The only difference was that this group had stopped showing it on the outside. Researchers came to call this pattern-avoidant attachment. And the explanation behind it is the part that should make you uncomfortable, because it isn't really about psychology. It's about strategy. These babies had learned something through repetition. Crying didn't bring comfort back faster. In some cases, crying seemed to push the caregiver further away or simply went unanswered enough times that it stopped being useful. So the behavior didn't disappear. It went underground. The baby adapted. Stop signaling distress outwardly and conserve the energy instead, because the signal isn't being answered anyway. This is worth sitting with for a moment. A baby, barely old enough to sit up on its own, already running a kind of cost-benefit calculation about whether expressing need is worth the energy. Why would evolution build something like that? Think about the environment your ancestors actually lived in, not the last few hundred years. The hundreds of thousands of years before that, small mobile groups, constant movement. A caregiver who might be hunting, foraging, fighting off a threat, or caring for multiple children at once. In that world, a baby who screamed nonstop with no ability to read the room would have been a liability to itself and to the group. A flexible signaling system would have been useful. Cry hard when there's a real chance someone will respond. Go quiet and conserve energy when there isn't. The baby's nervous system seems to be calibrating in real time based on the actual responsiveness of the world around it. That's not a flaw. That's a remarkably efficient prediction machine, built before language, built before memory as you'd recognize it, simply reading patterns and adjusting behavior accordingly. And here's where the story stops being about infancy and starts being about you. Researchers who followed these children for decades found something striking. The attachment pattern measured in a strange room with a stranger and a one-way mirror, often before the child could speak in full sentences, predicted patterns in their adult relationships. How they handled conflict, whether they reached for connection when stressed or pulled away and insisted they were fine, whether vulnerability felt safe or felt like exposure. A psychologist named Mary Main extended Ainsworth's work decades later and found something that made the picture even more layered. Adults could be interviewed about their own early childhoods and their patterns of talking about those memories, not just what happened, but how coherently and openly they could discuss it, match their own children's attachment patterns with striking consistency. The pattern doesn't just predict your future. It can echo into the next generation unless something interrupts it. Think about the adult who insists they're just very independent and don't need much from people, who feels a flicker of something close to panic when someone gets too close and resolves it by pulling back rather than leaning in. Who can list, intellectually, all the reasons connection matters, while their body does something completely different the moment it's actually offered. That's not necessarily a personality. Sometimes it's a strategy, one built so early, so far below conscious memory, that the person carrying it has no idea they're still running a calculation made in a crib. The argument over how much to comfort a crying baby isn't really a modern parenting debate. It's a much older argument your own nervous system has already had with the world, long before you had any say in the outcome. The question was never simply whether to comfort a child. The deeper question, the one your body answered for you before you could ask it, was whether reaching out for connection actually works. It helps to understand why Ainsworth's measurements were considered so rigorous for their time, because the strength of the discovery is in the detail. She wasn't relying on parents' self-reports, which can be unreliable and biased toward how a parent wants to see their own relationship. She was relying on direct, structured observation. Trained coders, watching the same 8-minute sequence, scoring specific behaviors, proximity seeking, contact maintenance, resistance, avoidance. The categories weren't vague impressions. They were operational definitions, applied the same way across hundreds of infants. This is part of why the findings held up. When other researchers, in other countries, with other cultures, ran the same procedure, they kept finding the same 3 broad patterns, even though the exact proportions shifted from place to place. Secure attachment was consistently the most common pattern almost everywhere it was tested, suggesting it isn't a cultural accident. It looks more like a default setting, one that gets disrupted under specific conditions, rather than chosen at random. So what disrupts it? It isn't usually cruelty. Most parents of avoidantly attached children aren't neglectful in any obvious sense. Often they're loving, present, and trying their best. What researchers found mattered more than affection alone was consistency of response, and what's sometimes called emotional attunement. A parent who is there physically, but who reliably misses or minimizes a child's distress signals, who responds with mild discomfort to crying rather than warmth, can produce the same avoidant pattern as a parent who is simply absent. That detail changes the entire emotional weight of the discovery. This isn't a story about bad parents and good parents. It's a story about a nervous system that is constantly asking one quiet question underneath every interaction. If I show you that I need something, will you actually meet it? And if the answer, learned across thousands of small repetitions, comes back no, the system adjusts. Not out of resentment, out of efficiency. There's a detail from later research that makes this even harder to dismiss as something that only matters in early childhood. Researchers studying adult romantic relationships, building on Ainsworth's framework decades later, found they could sort adults into strikingly similar categories using nothing but how people describe their relationship patterns. Securely attached adults tended to describe relationships as something that came relatively easily, where intimacy didn't feel threatening. Anxiously attached adults described a kind of hyper-awareness of the relationship, a fear of losing it, a tendency to seek constant reassurance. Avoidantly attached adults described valuing independence highly, sometimes uncomfortable with too much closeness, and often insisting they didn't need much from a partner at all, even while showing physiological stress responses, strikingly similar to what Ainsworth measured in those quiet infants decades earlier. The pattern from the crib doesn't disappear. It just gets a more sophisticated vocabulary. There's something almost humbling in this. You like to think of your adult relationship habits as choices, reasoned, examined, yours, and to some degree they are, especially with enough self-awareness and the right experiences to recalibrate. But underneath the reasoning, there's often a much older program running, one installed before you had any words for what was happening to you, built entirely out of how reliably the world responded when you reached for it. This is also where the story becomes less bleak than it might first sound. Attachment researchers who followed people across decades found something important. These patterns are not fixed sentences. They're starting points, not end points. A securely attached adult relationship later in life, a therapist who consistently shows up, a friendship where someone proves, again and again, that reaching out actually works, can shift the pattern. Researchers sometimes call this earned security. It takes longer to build than it took to break, but it isn't permanent. Which brings the question back to where it started, but heavier than before. Tonight, somewhere, a baby will cry in a crib. A parent will stand just outside the door, caught in that same modern argument about independence and attachment that gets repeated in books and forums and well-meaning advice columns. But the harder question was never really about the baby. It's about you, right now, in whatever relationship you're standing closest to. When something hurts, do you reach out and say so? Or do you do what some of those infants learned to do in a room with a stranger and a one-way mirror, decades before you were born, and just go quiet, breathe steady, and call it independence?